Thank you all. Moving on to your last lecture, last talk before the lunch break, I would like to welcome Dr. Habibul Haque Khondker, Professor, Department of Social Sciences, Zayed University, United Arab Emirates. As usual, formal introduction of Professor Khondker and his talk will be presented by the session chair. For that matter, I would like to welcome and request the chair, Dr. Chaudhry Fayaz Hussain, Professor, Department of Pharmacy, East West University, Bangladesh, to conduct the session. Let's welcome Professor Dr. Fayaz Hussain. Sir, please, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anisur Rahman, for introducing me. I feel honored to serve as a session chair of this seminar, which is addressing the present need of the time. I would like to extend my thanks to Institutional Quality Assurance Cell of East West University for inviting world-renowned professors to share their opinions through this seminar. Now, we have another internationally well-known distinguished professor, Dr. Habibul Haque Khondker, with us. I'm welcoming him to the East West University of Bangladesh. And now I would like to take the opportunity to introduce him before requesting him for his valuable talk. Dr. Habibul Haque Khondker is a professor at the Department of Social Science at Zayed University, Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. Professor Khondker received Andrew Mellon Predoctoral Fellowship at the University of Pittsburgh, USA. His achievements also include the Outstanding Faculty Award at Zayed University in 2013 and Distinguished Alumni Award from the University of Pittsburgh in 2012. He is the co-president of the Research Committee, Social Transformation and Sociology of Development of International Sociological Association, and a member of the Executive Council of the Global Developmental Network. He is an expert member of Bangladesh Accreditation Council. Now I am requesting Professor Khondker to deliver his talk. You have 40 minutes to talk, and there is 10 minutes for question and answers. Professor Khondker, please, floor is yours now.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my ideas about globalization, and especially globalization of higher education, globalization of university. But I want your permission, you need to allow me to share my screen so that I can show.
Yes, you can do, I guess. So yeah, you have that permission. Okay.
Because when I was trying, it said that.
Okay, just Professor Dr. Manjur Khuda.
Yeah, I think one person can share a screen. So if you are sharing, then I can't. So, okay, let me try again.
There is a green button saying share screen.
Yeah.
If you kindly press that button, that should give a panel whereby you should select the screen and share.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can you see it now, the screen?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
Not yet.
Let me try again. Screen share, it says.
Screen share, and you have to select the screen.
Yeah, I'm sharing that, but I can see.
You have to open your file first in your computer, then you can share.
Exactly, my file is open here.
Then hit share button, share screen button.
Yeah. Share.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's coming.
It's one password again. Okay.
It's asking you.
Yeah, now you can see.
Now, thank you very much. Sorry for this little glitch.
So you can do a slide share mode, slideshow mode. So it will be bigger.
Yeah. You can see it now, right?
Yeah, we can see, but you can maximize it by if you press on
I just want to keep it small so that I can see you also. Okay. So
even after that, you can see us. You just start giving slide share.
Yeah, but you can see it now, the slide share. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
You can
go
see this
ahead,
screen.
Professor. You go ahead. We are
Yeah.
seeing the slides.
You are seeing the slides. Okay. So I just want to start with some preliminary remarks. The first remark is that I want to thank you all for organizing this webinar, because there's so much going on and I'm learning so much from the previous speakers. And this is exactly what I had in mind when I was preparing this, that the main idea is to take advantage of this unfortunate situation and get connected with the rest of the world and find out, what they're doing, how we can leverage on their experience in improving our educational system. So I just wanted to say that as a prefatory remark. Now, in my presentation, I would spend a little bit of time discussing the whole idea of globalization, the conceptualization of globalization, and how is this idea of globalization dealing with the present realities of the global condition, affected by pandemic and the economic downturns that are taking place as a consequence of this pandemic. So I'm going to touch on that. And then I'm going to address the issue of globalization of university and how university can play a role in the process of globalization. And towards the end, I'll have my own reflections as to what can be done, what needs to be done, and so on. So let me begin with the conceptual part. And the first slide, as you can see, I start with this whole discussion of deglobalization. Especially, after the pandemic, people began to say, look, this pandemic has been caused by globalization. It's time to retreat from globalization. And that kind of rhetoric has been fueled by someone like President Donald Trump and others. But the point I'm trying to make, that this idea or this discussion of deglobalization began at least since 2016, 2017. So we really need to go back and see why was suddenly this talk about deglobalization. The deglobalization discussion was, sort of blown out in various newspapers and magazines. One example is February 2017 issue of Foreign Affairs, which is the premier sort of journal of international studies, had a whole issue devoted to the discussion of deglobalization. There are several articles, and they were talking about Brexit, and they were talking about the election of Donald Trump, that these were sort of examples of deglobalization. And as you remember, that the main platform for the candidate Donald Trump was his anti-globalization rhetoric and his anti-globalization position. So I just wanted to untangle that. I wanted to reflect on that. And the point here is that in most of those discussions, they were reducing globalization only to economic globalization. And that kind of reductionist approach has to be prevented, and we need to rescue the meaning of globalization, the concept of globalization, from that kind of narrow definition of globalization. Okay, so I raise this question: is globalization over? It is not. It's like Mark Twain's death. The demise of globalization is an exaggeration. So Brexit may hinder regionalization, but it's not really an end to globalization. There'll be all kinds of relationships, and we can see that, and I can elaborate more on that. So we need to think of globalization not just as economic relationships and integrations of economies around the world. We need to broaden the scope and broaden the meaning of globalization. And one of the terms which is reflected in the premier journal of globalization, it's called globalizations. So there are multiple views and plural ideas about globalization that we need to capture. So in defining globalization, how I proceed, I proceed with this question of, or this issue of what globalization is not. So globalization is not McDonaldization or Americanization. Globalization is not Westernization. Globalization is not capitalism globalized, which is often referred to as neoliberal globalization. That is, there's only one form of globalization, and every time there's an economic downturn, global economic recession, and people start talking about end of globalization and so on, without realizing that there has always been ups and downs in the economic systems globally. Okay, so we simply use this definition of globalization from Roland Robertson, who is one of the pioneers, or could be the leading pioneer in conceptualizing globalization sociologically. And he simply thought of globalization as compression of the world, and then our growing consciousness of that compression. And this idea is tied to McLuhan's idea of global village, that the whole world, the whole globe is now, very much within our everyday discussion. We are sitting in Bangladesh or in Abu Dhabi or in Singapore, and we are concerned with what's going on in American election, when Donald Trump is going to concede and so on. So this sort of consciousness of the world is very, very central, and we can, take that to the discussion of universities. In Bangladesh, we are talking about ranking of Linglam University. We're talking about Singapore, in US, and what's going on in American educational scene. So that consciousness is extremely important. So we define globalization as a macro social historical process, which is both entangled and contingent. So it's not like one-way flow of developments, moving forward all the time. No, there are contractions, there are all kinds of upheavals, there are contingencies, but deep down, the process goes on. And this is something we really need to understand before we can address the issue of globalization of higher education. We really need to, disassemble the concept. What does it actually mean? How should we understand this idea of globalization? Is it simply integration of world economy? I think it's much more than that. Okay, so it's a process which transforms and it gets transformed. It's a series of inescapable entanglements. So we need to keep that idea of entanglements as central in our discussion of globalization. So when we think of globalization, we really need to think of globalization as multidimensional. And there are multiple discourses of globalization. And my professor Roland Robertson and I wrote an essay way back in 1998 in International Sociology, titled it as Discourses of Globalization. So we really need to understand that there's no single discussion of globalization. So globalization is not static. We cannot simply say, okay, we have arrived at globalization. This is a process. It's dynamic. And here I quote, without much humility, our own definition: the globalization process, must change and adapt to newly emerging conditions. And we use this phrase, global pandemics, global financial crisis, economic inequality, population movement. These are forces that might, dent, that might impact, the very idea of globalization. So it's not like globalization has failed. Globalization, is affected by all these processes all the time. And we wrote that more than 10 years ago, the book published in 2010. And this is a copy of the book, for you to look at. It's a Sage publication. Anyway, we move on because I kind of reduce this complexity by saying, okay, there's a thin theory of globalization and there's a thick theory of globalization. The thin theory was popularized by a brilliant journalist. He is absolutely top class Pulitzer award-winning journalist from New York Times, Thomas Friedman. And he wrote a book, The World is Flat, and I saw him when he came to Singapore to give a talk to promote his book many years ago. And the point is that he simply said, okay, there's economic globalization and there's sharing of internet and the world has become flat. Now that idea actually grows out of this Reagan-Thatcher era of neoliberal globalization of the 1980s. And then in the 1990, around the time when really existing socialism, the Soviet socialism, came to a crashing end with the crash of Berlin Wall. And suddenly people said, okay, that's it. Globalization is over and we should just go back to our own national enterprises. We should focus on nationalism and take care of our own stuff. I mean, that was one reaction. I'm sorry. The reaction was that this is the end of socialism. So this is the end of ideology. So we really need to embark on this future, in a world without history, world without borders and so on. And it's the flattened view of world, which was immediately criticized by sociologists like Richard Florida and others. They said, look, the world is uneven, let's accept that, and yet there is connectivity. And we need to look at this connectivity that began long time ago with Silk Road and the spread of religion, the spread of ideas, the spread of technology. So there's no way you can simply say that globalization began in 1990s, as Thomas Friedman argued. So the thin theory of globalization focuses on economic globalization. They focus on homogenization, meaning that the world is becoming same. And that was the view of Ritzler, the McDonaldization guru, the thesis that was given by Ritzler, the sociologist, that world is becoming McDonaldized. And I had a big argument with him when he came to Abu Dhabi. The world is not being homogenized. We all know that, okay? So the thick theory of globalization that I call sociological globalization focuses on heterogenization. The world is becoming more and more complex. It's not becoming flat. It's not becoming homogenized. And one concept that we have been using, Roland Robertson again is the pioneer in the development of that concept, is localization, which combines globalization with local input. And I have argued that university is a very good example of a localized institution. It's not globalized, and I'll come back to that. So if we accept thin theory of globalization, then yes, there's a process of deglobalization because that's the economic, narrow, homogenized view. If we accept the thick theory, and we must, the sociological idea of globalization, the march of globalization will continue. And it's not right, it's not like I'm saying that, yeah, globalization is good, we should ride on globalization. No, this is the reality that I'm simply accepting. So here I will skip that because this is more theoretical, who are the intellectual gurus, whose ideas inform the idea of globalization, Benjamin Nelson, Immanuel Wallerstein. There's there are tons of literature on this subject. I want to skip that so that we can talk about the many phases of globalization. It's multidimensional. It is an economic process. There's no denying the fact that it's economic, but it's also a technological process. It's a political process. We're painfully concerned with what's going on in America. We are concerned with what's going on elsewhere in the world. We are talking about social processes. Why, let's say, the pandemic is faced with different responses in different parts of the world. Why in one place people are not wearing masks? Why in Singapore? Why in Taiwan? Why in Hong Kong? Why in China? Everyone is wearing a mask. It's not an issue. It's not an issue of individual freedom versus control. They're simply saying, look, it makes sense. In many parts of the world, we don't have that. And that's why sociology comes into play. We really need to understand, all these phenomena sociologically. This is not a scientific problem. Everyone understands the science of it, but there are people who do not want to believe in science, and how do you deal with that? So you really need to understand the institutional processes, the cultural processes. So these are the faces or facets of globalization. Okay. Again, we need to remind ourselves that globalization is deeply historical. All you need to do is just think of religion. Why do you have, why do you have Hinduism in Bali, Indonesia? Why do you have Islam? Islam originated in the Middle East, in the Arab world, and you have Islam in China, and a huge number of Muslims in China. So you really need to understand the dispersion of ideas, dispersions of religious values, dispersions of ideologies. Marxism, was not an Asian, not a Chinese product. Marxism grew in Europe, but China adopted it, Vietnam adopted it. So you see this sort of transmigration of institutions, like universities and institutions. A very good example. We had universities in one place, and then we see the idea of university travels around the world. So in order to historicize the idea of globalization, and here I'm again indulged in self-publicity, but I cannot avoid it, that there's an article coming out maybe next week in the journal Globalizations called Eurasian Globalization, where I try to identify 3 different phases of globalization. So we are now in phase 3, and that phase 3 starts with 21st century. So there's a new form of globalization that we are dealing with. And for a long part, what we had was the Atlantic globalization, the so-called Europe-dominated or North America-dominated globalization in the 20th century. But before that, for a millennia, we had the early Eurasian globalization. And I'll come back to that briefly. So either we can look at globalization, and this is how journalists tend to look at it. And I don't demean journalists, but this is the thin theory that sells well, that globalization is a destructive force. It's destroying our cultures, our language, our traditions, and somehow we should stop it. We should get rid of it. But the other way is that it's an opportunity, and we need to take advantage of that opportunity, right? It's not simply a force that is destroying. There are different ways we can look at globalization. And if we simply go and check this out, this essay by Amartya Sen, where he is reminding us that over thousands of years, globalization has contributed to the progress of the world through travel, trade, migration, the spread of cultural influences, and dissemination of knowledge, science, and technology. And he gives this example, the high technology around year 1000, so 1 millennium ago. The high technology was paper, invention of paper, the idea of printing press, gunpowder, magnetic compass, and all to be found in China. And since then, these technologies have gone, let's say, from the east to the west. The decimal system is a great example that Amartya Sen points out. Arab mathematicians, they got this from India, and then from the Arabs, Europe got these ideas. So there was a knowledge transfer, there was a technology transfer from the so-called East to the so-called West. And the Western scientific developments, the later Renaissance, the age of enlightenment, the age of reason, they were, directly, dependent on the ideas and the concepts that traveled from the East to the West. So we really need to rethink, we really need to think out of the box and get out of this very Atlantic view of globalization, this very Eurocentric view of globalization, and broaden it, that for a long time, the globalization was actually fueled by the ideas developed in Asia, okay? And some writers call it Asian globalization. Okay, so the takeaway points from the brief introductory discussion: globalization is a historical macro-social process. We call it a process of processes it's multidimensional, it involves cross-border mobility and connectivity. And I want you to keep these two concepts in front of you. One is mobility, the other is connectivity. So the concepts and ideas such as cosmopolitanism, glocalism, isomorphism, a concept advanced by John Mayer, which, as scientists, we know that this is a concept that comes from science, chemistry and other fields. And these concepts are central in understanding globalization of higher education. So one example of isomorphism, it's related to diffusion. So once Dhaka University was imagined as Oxford of the East. Why Oxford of the East? Why not University of Paris of the East? Why not University of Bologna of the East? Because it was modeled after Oxford, and modeled meaning that university would be divided into different halls, So it's a kind of residential university. So you have at Cambridge and Oxford a master of house. Amartya Sen was master of house at Cambridge at one point in time. So the idea of modeling, the idea of replication of institutions, as Honorable Minister yesterday said, that we don't need to reinvent the hammer. Hammer has already been invented. We may have to retool that hammer to meet our own condition. And that's where the idea of localization comes, that we take the model provided by, let's say, Singapore Institute of Technology. We need to bring it to Bangladesh, and that model needs to be readjusted and retooled and reprocessed in view of the local conditions. And that's what we mean by globalization. Okay, so in terms of globalization and higher education, the first thing we need to remember that higher education drives and is driven by globalization. So we play a role in the process of globalization as we are being continuously affected by the process of globalization. So globalization is a phenomenon of increasing worldwide interconnectedness. That's where the connectivity comes. It combines economic, cultural, social, political changes. Higher education develops human resources, right? Now, here I really want to disassemble the idea of higher education. That if we think of higher education in engineering, in science, in applied science, it has a different meaning when we talk about human resource. And I fully agree with our speakers earlier today, Professor Yong, that in Singapore, you really need to integrate science education, engineering education with industry, with the future employers, with the economic institutions that are at the driving seat. You really need to integrate that what kind of human resources they need. And there's an excellent contribution by Henry Escovitz, who I had the good fortune of meeting and developing a friendship. Henry Escovitz pioneered this idea of triple helix, not in the scientific sense, the scientific concept of triple helix. Escovitz brought that idea of triple helix to talk about the relationship between university, industry, and government. So these are the components in his triple helix. And he wrote a fascinating book called The Entrepreneurial University. So this is the last stage of university. So university as a teaching institution, university as research university, and finally entrepreneurial university. And he looked into MIT as a case study. So this is a book I highly recommend. If we look at university in terms of its contribution to the economy. But when I think of university or higher education developing human resource, I broaden that idea of outcome. The outcome can be narrowly viewed as skilled development, whether you are employable, whether you can contribute to the economy directly, to the industrial process, to the fourth industrial process. And here is the fourth industrial revolution. And the book I received was in 2016, soon after it was published, because the author, Klaus Schwab, came to Dubai to give a talk at the Dubai government conference. Anyway, so if we talk about that kind of integration between technology, knowledge, and economic production, yes, we are focusing on technical education, but I'm focusing more on liberal arts education. What's the role of liberal arts in modern universities, which is not the topic of today's discussion, but you need to understand that my focus is more on the other side of education. And that other side, I think, is very central. I think if COVID has taught us one lesson, that lesson is science on its own is helpless. Unless you have a deeper understanding of culture and society, you really cannot fight, this pandemic. It's eventually a much broader issue than a technical problem. Okay, so in terms of globalization of higher education, we really need to look at this cross-border flows of ideas, the students, faculty, financing, and a couple of other things. How information communication technology is playing a role, and we can see that today, even in this process of our webinar discussion. So there's competition, there's collaboration, and we find much of this information in the OECD report of 2009. But is this idea of global university a new idea? It is not, right? The idea goes back to Nalanda. And we know that in 2007, they suddenly started to rebuild Nalanda, and now Nalanda is an operational university in Bihar, right? Now, Nalanda is one of the oldest universities in the world. It started off as a Buddhist monastery, like many of the universities in the West, Oxford, Cambridge, especially Oxford, and even earlier than Oxford, University of Bologna, they all had ties to religion. So there's a connection between religion and higher education very early on. I didn't want to address this issue of history of university because of the challenges of definition of university. Because if you define university in a very broad way as a place, as a space for, thinking, as a space for philosophizing, as a space for developing new ideas, you need to go back to Plato's academy. So, you need to go back to Aristotle's and all the Greek sort of contributions, this whole idea of creating a space of free discussions. That was the beginning of university. But then when we come to example of Nalanda, there are examples from the Islamic world of early universities, they're very closely tied to religion and, expounding religious ideas and so on. Okay. So the idea of Nalanda is important because at that time they were recruiting, recruiting is not the right word here. They were getting students who came all the way from China, from what is now Japan, Korea, all of East Asia, many of the East Asian countries, they came to India, they came to Bihar, to Nalanda, and the connection was again religion, Buddhism. Buddhism attracted them. They wanted to learn about, Indian culture, the culture that created, Buddhist philosophy, and they came and spent time at Nalanda. So this was probably one of the oldest universities that we can think of. Now, fast forward from the time of Nalanda University to the 21st century. So if we look at the top 25 universities of the world, and I don't want to, because this is an information you can access very easily, that what I'm saying that most of the top universities are in the West, whether it is Oxford, and it depends. There are many, many different rankings of the universities, and there's a growing literature where people are kind of unhappy. They're saying, oh, who are these rankers anyway? What do they know about universities? Because some of the rankers are professional rankers, like QS. QS not an university, it's a ranking organization. So there's some kind of unhappiness, uneasiness with regard to university ranking. There's some skepticism. I'm personally quite skeptical about ranking universities because certain things cannot be ranked. You cannot say that the Sandesh of Dhaka is better than Sandesh of Kolkata. Sandesh is Sandesh, they're always good. So you cannot rank everything. But, we try to rank and we say, okay, Oxford is number one, Caltech is number 2, not Caltech, California Institute is number 2, and so on.
Sorry, we have 5 minutes left, please.
Okay, so I skipped that. I completely skipped that discussion of ranking of universities. All I want to talk about in the remaining 5 minutes, that there's a great deal of mobility of students, right? Now, where are the students going? Which are the countries that are being able to attract huge number of students? USA is still number 1, UK is number 2. And you see China is there, but China is what, ranked 7th, 8th, China, Japan. China is attracting 200,000 students. And remember, they're all tertiary students. But something that is little known, and I have the audacity to so little known, because look at this table. If you look at the recent ranking, not ranking in terms of who is number 1, who is number 2, universities that publish the best articles in number 1 journals in computing, in mathematics, in that list, you have MIT, you have Stanford, but the list is dominated by universities of Asia. China, Singapore, Hong Kong, they dominate that list. You see the top 9, only 3 American universities are there, Stanford, MIT, and Berkeley. The rest of the universities are all Chinese and Singaporean and Hong Kong. These are the universities that are at the forefront of innovation and production of scientific papers, right? But the students are still going to US, UK, Australia, Germany, Russia, France. China is beginning to host more and more foreign students. South Korea, Singapore, a small country, still, that's not a bad number. 51,000 tertiary students are in Singapore. So again, these are not important, these numbers, but what are the challenges of globalization? Again, I come back to this idea of globalization. The environmental cost, extreme social inequality. Now, what are the opportunities? How do we move forward from here, okay? So moving forward, the role of education, the role of tertiary education has to be redefined. And we all knew that the primary task of university is to produce global citizenship, okay? So, and that can only come through global education. It will create a cosmopolitan culture, and that will foster understanding across cultures. We need to develop empathy, mutual respect, and appreciation of difference. Now, one thing I greatly appreciate, I admire, and thank the organizers of this conference, that you invited speakers from Singapore, from Hong Kong, to share their knowledge, because these are countries that are at the forefront of fourth industrial revolution. These are countries that have actually harmonized Western education without getting into a long debate about colonialism and education. They said, okay, that's past. Let's look at what we can learn from universities in US. And that was exactly the approach of Japan. So I'll just end with this little anecdote of Japan. A famous historian of Japanese science, in a talk, I remember I was there, he said, anyone in the early part of 20th century, the first decade of 20th century, you go to Japan, you will hardly see any Japanese professor teaching in Japanese technical colleges. Japan was very famous for these technical colleges. They were all the professors there were Europeans from other parts of the world. They came and they taught. In the middle part, in the 70s and 80s, you go to Japan, you'd hardly see any Western professor. So they didn't care where the professors came from. There was no parochialism, there was no nationalism, there was no racism. They said, look, if they're good professors, bring them, learn from them, and when we can take care of our own destiny, when we can take care of our own institutions, they will go back. Again, today, in 21st century, you go to Japan, you see many foreign professors, because this is a new phase of development, and they're in tune with the new processes all the time. You see the same thing in Singapore, the percentage of professors from other countries. They don't make a nationalist, platform that we are Singaporeans, we should teach our own students. They said, look, we want good professors no matter where they are from. So that kind of global orientation is absolutely crucial for the transition to Industrial Revolution 4.0. Okay, so with that, we really need to understand the differences. We need to appreciate the differences. We have to embrace the differences. And we really need to create this sort of cosmopolitan worldview before we can enter into this advanced phase of globalization and this global higher education. So COVID-19 actually has created an opportunity for global cooperation. And today's webinar is an example of that kind of global cooperation and global interdependence. Thank you very much. And I'll be happy to answer questions if you have any. Okay, I can't hear you. Professor Chaudhary, your microphone is...
I'm sorry, I unmuted my microscope. Sorry for that. Thank you, Professor Khondker, very much for your excellent presentation. Now floor is open for question. I'm requesting the participant to write your questions in the designated box, and panelists are requested to unmute the microphone and ask the question. So I have several questions, I guess. Okay. So one of the questions is there from Momita Tanjila. She says, do the University of Developing Countries having limited resources can meet the challenge of globalization?
I think we are doing it right now, because all you need is an internet-enabled phone. That's all you need. Frankly, that's all you need. You can connect to the rest of the world. You need where to go to. You can connect to Yale University free courses through Coursera if you have an internet-enabled phone. So the challenges can be made. And you know, there's a myth of limited resources. I don't think we have limited resources. As the Honorable Minister mentioned yesterday, the government is giving loan to students, giving money to students to buy phones, internet devices, so that we can be connected. And we have excellent mentors at home, you know, who can guide you through this process. So we are not really shortage of resources. We need to understand how do we connect different points, you know. There's one point that has technology, one point that has the mentorship, and one point where we have the need. So you need to connect these points. We can overcome the shortage of resources.
Thank you. Another question from Helaluddin. He wrote, one of my friend went to Hungary for higher study from Bangladesh. One day he searched for food and went to McDonald's shop. He found food catalog in their Hungarian language, where only McDonald's words is written in English. Can we say it's globalization?
It's an example of globalization, but that's a bad globalization. Yeah. In most countries, they have both in English and in their local language. You know, that would be a better option. Yeah.
Okay, another question I have from Dr. Hakim. He wrote something, so I'm reading it. The OB framework, obviously a necessary paradigm shift from traditional educational system. This system has greater focus on program, course outcome, industrial interaction, and has the requirement to map universities' mission, vision with individual program outcomes and with the root level course outcomes. To get this new educational system to function effectively, we need proper investment and help in relation to the following issue. How can we deal with the requirement of aggressive tech support like computing facility, internet, etc., bearing in mind that the current pandemic necessitated the online teaching activity in country like Bangladesh? Where to find source of funding to address these bottlenecks? It's number one question. And number two, what will be the deal what will be the ideal student-teacher ratio and the course load for a plausible OB practice environment?
Okay, I think again, the question number one, I would break it into two parts. One is science education, technology-based education. So if you're teaching a course on chemical engineering, then obviously the OBE should be clearly stated that what are the outcomes. It should be stated very clearly, and you need to do that in conjunction with the industrial needs, as our Singaporean speaker pointed out, as Dr. Yong pointed out, that you need to consult the industries, you need to consult Beximco, you need to consult the Square, what kind of pharmaceutical products they're making, and how should we reorient our pharmaceutical training program, BFAM program, or microbiology or micro sort of biochemistry programs. So you need to consult. So that's where your outcome will come. But when you think of liberal arts, that you are running a program in history, in philosophy, in sociology, the outcomes would be very different, because here you have no industrial counterparts. You have the larger world to think about. And the difference between traditional and modern outcome-based education, the difference is implicit versus explicit. The implicit, so we talk about university mission, we talk about university vision. We look at Harvard University. The mission statement is one word. The word is veritas. The veritas, the Latin word, veritas means truth. So what is the outcome? The outcome is that students should seek truth. You see, that's all. So very broadly speaking, the university, the purpose of university is to open our mind. And some people need to go to university to open their mind. Some people don't need to go to university. Rabindranath Tagore, Nazrul Islam didn't go to university, but we study them. We study Tagore for ideas of cosmopolitanism. He never went to university or never graduated from university, right? So the idea that we need to broaden our mind. So the second point is, it's not a resource. The main barrier in Bangladesh, as in many other places, we should not simply identify Bangladesh as a target. The main problem is mindset, that we have to come out of the mindset. And that's what is meant by thinking out of the box. The first thing we say in Bangladesh, I'll just mention two things. In Bangladesh, those things will not happen. We have to get out of the mind. We have to say, in Bangladesh, those things will happen. The second thing, we focus on the problems. If you start with thinking of the problems, all you will get is problems. If you think with the mindset of solution, you will find solutions every step. If Bangabandhu started with problems, oh, Pakistan is too difficult, they have a big army, they will kill us, Bangladesh will not come into being. If Professor Yunus starts with, oh, these big banks and these Mahajans, we cannot fight them, there won't be any Grameen Bank. So all the visionary leaders that we have from Bangabandhu onwards, they went against the grains of the time. They went against the challenges. They said, look, we have to fight, take these challenges, and we have to fight. And that's the approach, that's the attitude you need. We stop with saying, okay, there's big bureaucracy, we cannot fight them. No, we have to begin to fight. If you do not begin, you will not accomplish anything. All journeys begin with one step. Let's take that step.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll take maybe one or two more questions. Istiak Bari, he wrote, excellent talk, sir. We all endorse the importance of having a good industry-university cooperation, but what actually hindering us in Bangladesh to develop such a cooperation?
The initiative. I think we have to take initiative. You invite, some of the industrial leaders of Bangladesh. You have prominent people like, Manzoor Elahi. You have famous people. You invite them. You talk to them. We always, when I was a student of Dhaka University, we looked at industries, we looked at multinational corporations as if they're enemies. We never thought they could be our partners, you see. So I think we need to change that mindset. And we look at it on the spirit of cooperation, that university, government, industry, they can work together, as they have done in in all the other countries where universities have been immensely successful. Not just Singapore, you look at Japan, you look at Korea, look at Germany, they have close connections. And the idea of fourth industrial revolution actually comes from Germany, from Hanover Fair, where this idea was first mooted. So you have that examples, that models before us. All you have to do is to find out what model will work better for us and how we can localize, globalize, and move forward. So we have to change our mindset. We have to have confidence. We have to have empathy for others, mutual respect. We cannot dismiss. And I really appreciate that you invited participants from Singapore. There's a lot to learn from Singapore.
Thank you, sir. Maybe we are running out of time. Just last question. I'm just reading, which come from Muhammad Shafiqul Islam. He wrote, knowledge and competitiveness should go hand in hand, but due to politics in Public University of Bangladesh, we hardly see them competing for creating knowledge, rather than they seem to running for power. What is your suggestion, Professor?
Again, as I have said, it's a mindset. Because when I was a student, there was politics. We didn't focus on politics. We took it as a given because you live in Bangladesh, there will be cyclones. You cannot simply say, oh, because of cyclone, I could not study. Is that a good excuse? No. There will be cyclone, but we have to study. There will be politics, we'll have to study. There will be forces. No one will come to you and say, no, you cannot read anymore. On that day, I will say, this is a real problem. But if there's politics, if some people are getting favors, that's not my problem. If I study, if I'm focused, I will be rewarded because I'm a global citizen. I'm not just working with the limited confinements. You broaden your mind and you focus on your own thing and forget about what others are doing. Don't use what others are doing as an excuse for not doing your own work.
Thank you, Professor. Actually, we are running out of time, so I cannot accept any more questions. So now I am handing over the floor to Dr. Anisul Rahman again. Please.
Thank you, Professor Fayaz Hussain, and for conducting the session smoothly with grace. And thank you, Professor Khondker, to enlighten us on challenges and opportunities that universities may face toward globalization. I'm hopeful that the devised challenges and opportunities that have been devised here will be considered by the East West University as well to become global and enjoy the benefit of true globalization. Thanks again, Professor Khondker, for your wonderful presentation.